My name is Taj. Thanks. As Sabrina said, my name is Taj Hittenberger. I am the Fire Stewardship Ecologist here at Point Blue Conservation Science. I work in our Working Lands program, and today I'll be talking about prescribed fire in Northern California, both how prescribed burns are planned and conducted, as well as some of the historical and ecological context for the use of fire in California. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with Point Blue, we are a conservation nonprofit organization based out of Petaluma, California, and we work to research and promote nature-based solutions for the health of wildlife and humans. We started out as the Point Reyes Bird Observatory in 1965, and while avian research has been our bread and butter for many decades, our work has expanded a lot since then, and we now do quite a lot of different work from Alaska down to Antarctica and all over California. And we have Point Blue staff that have been doing research on bird response to wildfire in the Sierras for a handful of years, but it's just in the last year or so that we've been working more in prescribed fire. So to give you a little insight into what I'm going to be covering today, I'm going to touch on cultural fire history in California and some basic fire ecology concepts, as well as the history and effects of fire suppression, which I think a lot of us are familiar with. Then I'm going to move on to some of the essential aspects that need to be considered in planning and conducting a prescribed burn, and I'm going to walk you through a case study to show you that. And then finally talk about some of the highlights and benefits of a model that's becoming more common here in California called the Prescribed Burn Association. So before I really jump into it, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from our offices in Petaluma, which is on the unceded homelands of the native Coast Miwok people, who are represented in part by the Federated Indians of Great and Rancheria, and also recognize their longstanding history of caring for this land. Despite generations of colonization and attempted genocide, Native Coast Miwok people still maintain their cultural identity and sovereignty here and continue to care for this place. And those of us who live here now are fortunate to benefit from their centuries of stewardship. I also want to frame today's conversation with an understanding of Native people's role in the ecology of fire in California. Valentin Lopez, the chairman of the Amamutsun tribal band in the central coast of California, says that his people regard fire as a sacred gift that was given to them by Creator to be used in caring for the land. And I just want to take a moment to recognize how drastically different that is from our common views of fire these days as something that's inherently bad or destructive or something that needs to be suppressed really out of existence. And I don't think our common idea or our common views of fire these days are going to be helpful for us in working towards a future and where we can live with fire. So Native people have been burning across the state, intentionally burning for at least 10,000 years for many social, cultural, ecological, and spiritual reasons. And this cultural burning has shaped and maintained many of the ecosystems that we know and love in California. I also want to build a little bit on the land acknowledgement that I just said and share an Indigenous fire acknowledgement that was written by someone named Jeremy Bailey, who's the director of prescribed fire training at the Nature Conservancy. While Jeremy is not Native, his thoughts and work are shaped by several Indigenous mentors and others close to him, and he was gracious enough to let me share this with you all. So he writes, in a historical and contemporary context, the Indigenous people of North America use fire at time and place and under conditions that have specific results. This learned use of fire is a scientific method and process, testing hypotheses, perfecting techniques, monitoring effects, replicating results, and sharing knowledge. Because of this cultivation of fire, 4/5 of North American ecosystems are adapted or even dependent on the routine presence of fire. This local history of fire use in North America is not exclusive to the continent, but rather emblematic of humans' role and now responsibility as part of nature around the world. In most cases where we want to burn, where it is our responsibility to restore and maintain There will be a family, a village, a tribe of people who have historically burned there, shaping the special collection of plants, animals, and conditions. Our efforts to restore fire should also include revitalizing the culture of fire use and should center around Indigenous and other historic fire practitioners and their proven techniques and knowledge. Our efforts should center on learning about and collaborating with the Indigenous people who directed fire's use for millennia. It is not enough to understand this history of fire. It is not enough to acknowledge the role and responsibilities of Indigenous people around the world. We must actively engage in learning from these communities while also collaborating and joining in the stewardship of fire. So the reasons for cultural burning are really countless, as Jeremy acknowledged, and the role and use of fire is shaped by local context. Fire is used by Native people throughout California for different ways and in different ways and for different purposes. So this is a general list, very, very general. But some of the reasons that cultural burning is to improve the quality and quantity of plants for harvesting things like food, medicine, tea, basketry material, and other uses. Fire is also used to improve forage for deer, elk, and other grazing animals that were hunted, and even used in harvesting other types of animals like insects. Fire is also used to clear areas around villages and camps and well-traveled areas, and also fire plays a significant role in ceremonial practices. And obviously I can't speak to those directly, but just want to acknowledge that is part of fire's existence on the landscape. As Native people have burned throughout much of California over at least the last 10,000 years, and continue to burn, the deliberate recurring use of fire has shaped plant communities and their distribution around the state. And in response to this frequent occurrence of fire, plants have adapted survival techniques to this. So we have a couple examples of that here in these images. On the top left, we have fire in a ponderosa pine forest. Ponderosa pines have really thick bark that shield the cambium layer, or the living flesh of the tree, from low to moderate severity fire. And on the top right, we have a chaparral ecosystem. Those kind of long spindly plants are chamise that are resprouting from their base after really high severity fire. And also on the bottom left here, we have Bishop pine in Point Reyes National Seashore. And Bishop pines have what are called serotinous cones. Their cones are sealed with resin, and they need really high heat for that resin to essentially melt away and those cones to open up, and then the trees can reproduce. So they are actually dependent on pretty high severity fire in order to regenerate. And then on the bottom right here, we have a couple other examples. Those tall spindly trees that you see, they kind of look like bottle brushes. Those are coast redwoods that are resprouting from their main stem after a fire. And then we have some toyon on the bottom right with the red berries that are resprouting from their base. And then that kind of hazy gray shrub that you can see in the foreground, those are actually ceanothus that have really proliferated after a burn. They have really hard seed coats that open up after a burn. So these are just a handful of examples. There's also a lot more. And when we talk about fire, the role of fire in plant communities, we really focus on the frequency that fires burn and the effects that they have on plants when they burn. And really what we're describing here is what are called fire regimes. And I say historic fire regimes here because fire regimes in many of our plant communities have been altered by fire suppression. So this table on the right here is showing something called fire return intervals, essentially the amount of time between fire events in various plant communities around California. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but I just want to point out at the top here, oak woodlands, the mean fire return interval, the average amount of time between fires is 12 years and as low as 5. And then towards the bottom, mixed grasslands, average amount of time between fires 2 years and as low as 1. And these plant communities around our state often occur in areas where lightning is pretty uncommon. So the only way that these communities could have burned this frequently is through the intentional burning by native people. So that's a little bit about fire frequency. Then we can look at fire severity. And it's kind of easiest to think about this on a spectrum. So let's have oak woodlands on one side of the spectrum. Oak woodlands have a very high frequency of fire. Fire happens frequently, but a very low severity fire regime. So typically oak canopies don't burn. It's typically the leaf litter, the grasses, and other forbs in the understory that burn. But on the other side of that spectrum would be an ecosystem like chaparral, where fire is not very frequent. On average, it burns every 55 years, but when it does, it's a very high severity fire where most of the plant material above ground is burned. And obviously plants in those ecosystems have adaptations to that type of disturbance. So historically, as fires burned, they would consume the available plants or fuel in a given area and would eventually stop when conditions were no longer conducive to burning. So either too wet or too cool, or when they reached an area where there wasn't enough available fuel to burn, such as the footprint of a past fire. And these patches of burned areas essentially limited the spread of future fire and also limited the severity at which those fires could burn because there wasn't as much fuel available. And inevitably, this variety in fire frequency and fire severity across the landscape produced a diversity of fire effects, or what we often call pyrodiversity. And this pyrodiversity is what created and maintained the really diverse mosaic of plant communities that we have in California. So under these conditions, an average of 4.5 million acres of California burned each year, and a large amount of that was lit by humans. So 4.5 million acres might be pretty hard to conceive of. So to help visualize this, this is a map of wildfires in California in 2020. In this year, 4.4 million acres burned. This is widely regarded as one of, if not the worst, wildfire season in California in recent memory. And a lot of people regarded it as unprecedented. And certainly in recent memory, that may be true, but when we look at it in a longer historical context, this amount or this number of acres burned is actually on par with the average number of acres burned historically. The difference, however, is that much of these areas burned at a higher severity than they would have under their historic fire regimes. So let's bring us a little more into the modern day. I'm going to touch a little bit on fire suppression. Like I said, I think a lot of people already understand what fire suppression is and some of the effects, but I also think it's important to remember this as we frame a conversation around prescribed fire. So starting in 1850, as part of a concerted effort to remove Native people from their lands, the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians banned intentional burning. And this really began the process of altering our fire regimes in California because indigenous burning played such a vital role. This was followed up in the early 1900s with the creation of the US Forest Service, which was tasked with protecting our forests from many things, but mostly from fire. And in 1910, big fires in Idaho and Montana that burned about 3 million acres in 2 days and took a lot of lives, really solidified what we now think of as our war on fire, or our full-on wildfire suppression policy. And since then, houses have, housing development has expanded into more rural and wildland areas. And the primary focus of suppression has gone from focusing on protecting trees and timber to now protecting life and property. And total wildfire suppression has really become our standard operating procedure. And we've become incredibly good at it. Just to put some numbers to this, in the US, we keep 98% of all wildfires under 300 acres. The 2% of wildfires that surpass that 300 acre threshold occur during the most extreme weather conditions and now account for 97% of all wildfire suppression costs. So despite us throwing lots of money and resources at this, we continue to have large wildfires, and the 17 of California's largest 20 wildfires have occurred in the last 20 years. So this problem is just getting worse. And we really live with the effects of this every year. I mean, we have the smoke, we have the evacuations, the loss of homes, the loss of livelihoods, even the loss of life. And you know, a lot of us in California, we feel this in a palpable way every year. There's also notable ecological effects of this. Wildfire suppression paired with other land management decisions have created really unhealthy forests where there are too many trees on the landscape, and it makes our forests more susceptible to disturbances like fire, pests, and drought. And when fires do occur, they happen during those really extreme weather conditions and burn at much higher severity than they would have historically. And even in some cases, our forests are transitioning to shrubland or to grassland. And throughout this whole process, our forests, as they burn in high severity wildfires, are becoming sources of carbon rather than what we think of as sinks of carbon, which ultimately contributes to climate change and further confounds this wildfire issue. And really, people will say we live in a wildfire paradox now, where our suppression now makes future fires worse, which beckons more suppression, which just feeds this positive feedback loop. So in California, fire is incredibly nuanced, but we can confidently say now that there are many ecosystems and regions in our state that now experience a deficit of frequent low to moderate severity fire. And we can see these regions in this map created by Hugh Safford and other researchers at the Forest Service. All the blue areas are regions of California where fire is now less frequent than it was historically. And the orange and red regions are areas where fire is now more frequent than it was historically. And you can see a pretty clear division between north and south. And that's why I'm predominantly focusing on Northern California for this. Southern California is kind of a whole different world. So given all of this, it's pretty clear that the complete wildfire suppression policy is no longer functional socially or ecologically. And I'd argue there are three key aspects that we need to address moving forward. One is restoring historic fire regimes. We also need to create opportunities for individuals and communities to heal from fears and trauma related to wildfires and fire in general. And we also need to equip communities with the knowledge, skills, and resources to develop their own resilience to the inevitable presence of fire in California. We really need to learn or relearn how to live with fire again on our terms. There's certainly many ways to address these needs, but the one I want to focus on is prescribed fire. So many people have probably heard of prescribed burning or controlled burning, but may not necessarily know what it is, let alone how it works. I often have people ask me, how could fire possibly be controlled? And why would I ever willingly light a fire on my property? And when we look at how media portrays fire, it's really easy to understand why people would ask those questions. So I'm gonna go over some of those questions and walk you through a case study of how a prescribed burn can be planned and conducted safely to meet a wide variety of management goals. But before I do that, I want to touch on some very basic aspects of fire behavior. So wildfire can often feel mysterious and unpredictable. There's actually quite a lot of research and understanding about how wildland fires burn the way that they do. So let's start with this triangle on the left. This is what's known as the wildland fire triangle, believe it or not. And the three factors on here, fuel, weather, and topography, are what dictate how any given fire will burn. So fuels are the materials that are available to burn, the grasses, leaves, branches, shrubs, trees, even buildings. And when we're looking at the flammability of fuels, we're really analyzing not only the amount of fuel that there is on the landscape, but the moisture content of that fuel and how the fuel is arranged. So generally speaking, the more fuel that there is, the closer it is to each other and the drier it is, the hotter a fire will burn. Weather obviously plays a role too. We know fires burn hotter on dry, windy days. And topography, or the shape of the landscape, also plays a role. Fire burns uphill faster than it burns downhill. And that's due in part to the fact that convective heat produced by a fire, heat rises, and as it rises, it preheats and dries out fuels that are upslope. So it's essentially prepping that fuel to burn faster and hotter. Hence, it travels faster uphill. When we work with fire, we combine these factors to estimate things like how fast a fire will spread, how long flames will be, and how much heat will be generated from the fire. So moving on to the graphic on the right, this shows us how fire spreads in different directions. So let's assume that a fire starts at that ignition point towards the bottom, that yellow dot, and the arrow is either pointing uphill or in the direction that wind is blowing. So that fire moving upslope or being pushed by the wind is called the head fire. It has the highest intensity and spreads the fastest. You can also see the flames are the largest. Fire moving downslope or against the wind is called a backing fire, and it has relatively short flames and spreads really slowly. And fire moving either across the slope or across the wind is called a flanking fire, and has severe intensity and a rate of spread that's roughly between a head and backing fire. So with this in mind, let's get into a case study of how to plan and conduct a burn. I want to say up front that this is one example of how to do it, and this can look many different ways depending on who's involved, what time of year it is, your management goals, and a lot of other factors. But this is the Creighton Ridge prescribed burn that we conducted here in Sonoma County in January of this year, just about 2 months ago. It was a relatively small unit, 3.5 acres of predominantly ponderosa pine and Douglas fir in a pretty rural setting. And the last time this area burned was in 1978 in a wildfire called the Creighton Ridge Fire. And these pine and fir were planted after that wildfire. So this burn that we conducted, we had about 18 people and 2 engines on site as backup. We ended up not using them, but these were just local community members. They were neighbors, they were volunteers, they were members of the local volunteer fire department, which you can see in the photo here on the bottom left. Our burn unit was actually right in front of the volunteer fire station, which was really cool. And 18 people might seem like a lot for a 3.5 acre burn, and it might be, but in our community burns, at least in the North Bay, we often find that they're overstaffed simply due to just local enthusiasm. A lot of people want to come out, learn how to use a drip torch, be around fire, and develop that competency and comfort with fire. So we utilize this, and we bring on more people than is necessary, and we use these burns to provide training opportunities for folks. So when you want to burn an area, first things first is you want to assess where you want to burn, and you want to determine whether fire is even a useful tool to help you achieve your management objectives. Fire is not applicable everywhere. So I just want to say that up front, but let's assume that you have selected your area, you've determined fire is the right tool. The first step in your process is developing what's called a prescribed burn plan. And there are templates out there that are really easy to find. You could just search California Burn Plan template, and it'll be a template with all of these sections laid out and ready for you to fill in. I would highly encourage you to have one of these for every burn that you do. They essentially outline how your burn will be conducted, and if there's any sort of issues that come up with your burn, any legal situations that you get into, you want to make sure that you have a burn plan that was prepared by an experienced person and that you adhered to that plan on the day of the burn. So let's walk through these. First things first is you give a burn unit description, your general location and setting. I would also say your plant community and what fuel type you're in. So for this Creighton Ridge burn, we would give the location. We'd say this is ponderosa pine and Doug fir forest surrounded by grasslands and oak woodlands. We then stated our specific goals and objectives for the burn. I would say it's always best when you're setting objectives to be specific. Have them be measurable so that you can determine how well you either achieved your goal or didn't. And I'll get a little bit more into that in the next slide here. But next thing is determining or describing what kind of unit preparations you need to do before you can burn. So these are things like, where are your control lines going to be? Are they roads? Are they mowed strips? Are you putting in things called hand lines? How are you preparing the unit? And do you need to do any sort of thinning or fuel reduction in your unit before you burn? Your next step is writing your burn prescription, which I'm going to talk through a little more in depth in the next slide here. And then you'll also write your smoke management plan. So in this, you're essentially identifying smoke sensitive areas nearby and how you're going to avoid sending smoke towards things like hospitals, schools, neighborhoods, and stuff like that. Next is your ignitions and holding plan, which is where you describe essentially how you're going to put fire on the ground and make sure that you keep it in the box that you created for it. So generally speaking, we always start a burn from the highest point or the downwind point and walk the fire down slope or into the wind, keeps it nice and controlled, keeps the flames relatively small. So this is where you would detail kind of those steps. And then next, you would state what resources you need for your burn. So that's how many people, how many tools, how much water you need, how many radios, pumps, hose, if you're going to use any engines. And this is how much resources you'll need to be able to safely conduct your burn. Then you'll move on to what's called mop up and patrol plan, which is you essentially saying, this is how we're going to make sure our fire is out at the end of the day. And this is how we're going to monitor it in the following days to make sure that nothing flares up. Or if it does, this is how we will address it. And then finally, you have what's called a contingency plan. So if your fire gets outside of the box that you created for it, what resources, how many people, how much water, what equipment do you need to address that? And also we typically identify roads around our unit where if a fire gets out, we can say, oh, we'll hold the fire along this road. I wish this map here was a little more zoomed out so you could see that. But and then that leaves me with a burn unit map. And you can see the unit map for this Creighton Ridge burn on the right here. So I think it's really important to touch on what a prescription is as well. This is what makes a prescribed burn prescribed. So the prescription is really the central part of a burn plan, and it details the conditions under which you can safely conduct your burn to meet your management goals. So for the Creighton Ridge burn, our primary focus was reducing fuel loading. So things like removing grass thatch, reducing the amount of forest litter and some downed wood, as well as killing some of the smaller pine and Doug fir trees. And you can see a photo here of what the unit looked like before the burn. And you can, once you have your goals established, or I should say, once we had our goals established, we knew that we wanted to maintain relatively short flame lengths. So using some fire modeling software paired with our own prior knowledge of burning in these settings, we developed a set of weather and fuel moisture parameters under which we could burn. And that's this table on the bottom right. This is essentially us stating these are the conditions under which we will light this fire. If it is too cool, we will not light it. And if it's too hot, we will not light it. And if while we're burning, it gets too hot, we'll put the fire out. So another thing you might want to specify in a prescription, the time of year that you're going to burn. In this circumstance, the time of year didn't really matter so long as our conditions were correct. But if you're burning to, say, manage yellow star thistle or some other invasive species, you want to be really specific about your timing to ensure that you're burning during a specific phase in the plant's life cycle. For something like yellow star thistle, you want to burn right before it goes to seed. If you burn after that or a little too early, you can actually create conditions under which an invasive species could further thrive. So timing can be really important, but wasn't necessarily in this Creighton Ridge burn. So once you have your burn plan developed, you're going to want to assess what type of permits you need in order to conduct your burn. So this is actually relatively straightforward in California. I know a lot of people have some preconceptions that the permitting is like really cumbersome and gets in the way of burning happening, but it's actually relatively simple. So in California, you can think of the year broken into two segments. There's the fire season, which goes from May 1st to roughly October 31st, or whenever CAL FIRE says the fire season's over. And then there's the winter season or non-fire season that goes from November 1st to April 30th. So throughout the entire year, you need an air quality permit, and you get that through your local air quality management district. They're pretty straightforward, easy to get, not really a hurdle at all. If you're burning during the fire season, you will also need a permit from CAL FIRE. They have a couple different permits that you might need depending on what you're burning, but no matter what, they're probably going to need to come out to your site, do an inspection, and look over your burn plan and sign off and approve it. So rather than going into the details of the differences between the permits, I would say if you're planning a burn during the fire season, contact your local CAL FIRE station as soon as possible, and just start the process and ask them, what do I need? What do you need from me? And how do we get this process going? In some circumstances, you may also need a local fire department permit. This is more common in populated areas. So if you're in a setting like that, I would check with them as well. So once you have this documentation, your burn plan, your permits are in place, you need to make sure that you have your people and your resources and your burn unit all prepped and ready for the day of the burn. So first things first, you want to make sure you have your control lines installed. Like I said, for the Creighton Ridge burn, or maybe I didn't say it, we had the west and south boundary were roads, and then the northeast boundary was a mowed strip. And you can actually see a photo of this on the top right. This is us clearing that mowed strip. Typically, a control line should be dug down to bare mineral soil so that there's absolutely nothing that can burn across that line. But because we were doing a burn in January, we had some grass green up already. We could use basically this green grass strip as our fire break. And this totally sufficed in this situation, but it's always context dependent, what type of fuel break you want and how big you want it. You also want to consider if you need to do any sort of fuels reduction along your control line. I mentioned this earlier, you might need to thin trees along the line or remove some brush and put it further into the unit. And this is really to keep fire behavior close to your line to a minimum. You don't want things getting too hot. People are going to be standing there. You also want to limit the risk of fire getting across that line as much as possible. You also want to keep your eye on the weather forecast. When we have a burn unit that is ready to go and we're looking to burn, I'm checking the forecast every day for that exact location. And I'm comparing those forecasted conditions to our prescription. And we may only get, a 2-day window where the conditions line up with our prescription, and you want to be able to act fast. And you want to keep eyes on this as much as possible. Another important aspect of preparations is notifying people that you're going to be burning. So these are neighbors, giving them a call, letting them know, letting the air quality district know, your local fire department, your local CAL FIRE station. We even put signs out on major roads when we burn. So as people drive by, they see a sign that says prescribed fire ahead. So they're not surprised when they see smoke rising. Essentially, you want to let people know that there's going to be fire in the area before they see it. For obvious reasons. You also want to make sure that you have all of your equipment in place and ready to use. So these are things like your personal protective equipment, your drip torches, fuel, radios, tools, really anything you might need. And that should all be detailed in your prescribed burn plan. So once you're prepped for the day, you get to the fun part. You get to actually conducting your burn. And like I mentioned earlier, we always start our burns at the highest point of the unit or the most downwind point. And we allow the fire to back into the wind or downhill. And you'll remember backing fire has the shortest flame lengths and spreads the slowest. So essentially what we're doing is we're taking that top control line, we're letting the fire back itself down. And as it does that control line is essentially getting bigger and bigger and bigger. We're building this bigger buffer area. And once we have enough built, we start igniting the inside of the unit. And during our burns, we typically have our crews broken up into 2 types. There's a holding crew, or there may be multiple holding crews. And that's what you see people doing here in the photos. They're working right along the control lines. They're igniting right along the control lines, and they're making sure that burn stays in the box. And then there are crews that are working on the inside of the unit, what we call firing crews, and they're igniting the inside. And holding crews and firing crews are constantly in communication and in sync with each other, making sure everything is controlled and that everyone stays in a safe position. We also monitor weather throughout the day to ensure that we are within our prescription, and to ensure that if conditions change, we can alter our firing techniques accordingly. So once we have ignited everything, we let things burn down for a while. And then we do what's called mop up, which is making sure that the fire is out, either across the whole unit or around the perimeter of the unit. And we do that, and then we have someone typically overnight and into the next few days monitor the unit. And oftentimes this is the landowner and maybe a couple other people, but they're making sure that the fire is not picking up in the coming days. So we've gone over how to plan and conduct a burn, but I think there's also a few key questions that people often have around prescribed fire. And one of the main ones is liability. What risk am I putting myself in by putting fire on my property? And when we talk about liability around prescribed fire in the US, our state laws typically fall into one of two main categories. There's simple negligence laws, and there's, or I should say, simple negligence states and gross negligence states. So in a simple negligence state, you would be liable for an escaped fire, any damages or suppression costs. You would be liable if you were shown to not be taking the necessary safety precautions, or if you weren't doing your due diligence. And that's somewhat open to interpretation. So a lot of people in simple negligence states don't feel like they want to put themselves at risk because that definition is so open to interpretation. In gross negligence states, though, you can only be held liable if you're shown to be very careless or have a complete disregard for safety in planning and implementing your burn. For a very long time, California was a simple negligence state, but just last year, Senate Bill 332 passed, and we became a gross negligence state, which provides landowners and burners a lot more liability protection and removes what many people widely regard as one of the main barriers to prescribed burning in California. For reference, a state like Florida, which actually leads the US in prescribed burned acres each year, they burn 2 million acres a year. They are a gross negligence state, and many people feel like they can get that much burning done because of their liability laws. So another question that I often get from people is, I'm a landowner, I want to do some burning. What are my avenues to do that? Who do I contact? How much is this going to cost? Who's going to do the burn? Like logistic questions. So I adapted this table here from a presentation given by Lenya Quinn Davidson, who's an area fire advisor with UC Cooperative Extension in Humboldt. And I actually put the link to her presentation, that YouTube address there, where she goes into this much more in depth. But I will go over these 4 options really quick and really encourage people to check out that presentation by Lenya. She's a huge asset to the prescribed burning world in California. So a lot of thanks to Lenya for her work. So your first option is working with CAL FIRE and their vegetation management program, or what's often just called VMP. And this is a 10-year contract with CAL FIRE where they plan and conduct the burns on your property, and they take liability for any potential damages or suppression costs associated with an escaped fire. That seems like a huge perk to many people. They don't have to do any work. They don't have to take on liability. It's great. It costs them close to nothing. But I will say there are some downsides, and the main one is that there is very limited agency capacity within CAL FIRE to get prescribed fires done. They work with seasonal crews, and if those seasonal crews are needed elsewhere for any reasons, they will not be burning on your property. So given that and shifting weather conditions, the window in which CAL FIRE can actually burn on your property is pretty small each year. They also need to go through an environmental review process, which is part of that 10-year contract. And I've seen around here that environmental review process taking 4 or 5 years. So that the first half of your contract is taken up by administrative tasks. So you may not get many burns done through this avenue, but a lot of people still do it, and they get acres burned, which is great. The second option is going with a contractor. And this entails hiring a certified burn boss to lead your burn. And the main perks with this is that they come with liability insurance, and they also come with their own resources and often with their own crews. So they can be pretty nimble with the timing that they burn, which is great. And, the landowner doesn't have to provide many resources other than paying the berm boss for their services, and that can actually get pretty expensive, anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 a day, which is certainly a significant hurdle for people. The third option is just doing it yourself. You have the right and the freedom to use fire on your property how and when you wish, so long as it fits into your permits that you have. The perks to this is that it's pretty low cost. The only limitations is your own time, your own resources, and your own labor, which does present a downside because when your time, resources, and labor are limited, it's hard to scale up the number of acres that you burn each year. And under this, avenue, you're also taking on the liability risk. So the fourth option is burning with what's called a prescribed burn association. And these are really groups of neighbors and community members that help each other in getting burns done on their property. It's really a neighbor helping neighbor approach, where people share equipment and skills and their time, and it allows them to much more easily scale up the number of acres that they're burning, as well as build trust with their neighbors and create educational and training opportunities. But again, you would take on the liability. I would say I've seen PBA, or prescribed burn association, PBA burns done where they hire a burn boss. So these can overlap a little bit. So I've mentioned PBAs a little bit, and I want to talk about what they are and how they are becoming increasingly valuable here in prescribed burning in California. So PBAs, like I said, are essentially community-led groups of landowners, managers, neighbors, and anyone else who wants to support each other in getting prescribed burns done. They can be pretty formal and organized and have their own 501c3 nonprofit, or they can be as simple as just a listserv where people solicit each other's help for burning. The Creighton Ridge burn that I mentioned earlier was a PBA, was a burn that our local PBA put on here in Sonoma County. This PBA model is really popular in the Southeast and Midwest, and becoming more common here in California over the last 5 years or so. This map here was produced in early 2021, and it shows that there's a PBA forming in Shasta County, though I have not been able to find any more information about that. I do know, however, that there is the Siskiyou PBA nearby, which I believe covers part of Shasta County, but does a lot of work in Trinity and Siskiyou counties. And they do a lot of burning and provide trainings from time to time. And I would encourage people to check out this website, calpba.org, to learn more about their local PBA and find also really helpful resources when you're planning prescribed burns. You can find those burn plan templates on this website. So to give you a little more sense of what a PBA can look like and the values that it can provide, I want to talk about the Good Fire Alliance, which is our local PBA here in Sonoma and Marin counties. We're essentially a group of 350 people, largely volunteers, who are all trained and certified firefighters. And we support landowners in conducting prescribed burns and also offer fire training opportunities for people around the North Bay. We're really led and supported by a couple key organizations and individuals in our region. I work a lot with them. And there's also a program in our area called Fire Forward, which houses the supply cache for the Good Fire Alliance, which is super helpful. Members of the Good Fire Alliance come from totally different backgrounds. There's ecologists like myself. There's also teachers, IT specialists, ranchers, students, and everything in between. And many of these people have come together because they've been affected by wildfires directly or indirectly, and not only want to learn how fire functions on the landscape, but also work together to create a cultural shift towards a broader use of ecologically beneficial fire in our area. And on the whole, this allows us to engage people in fire work who otherwise wouldn't have any opportunity to develop experience in fire. And it's hugely valuable to people who are working through some of the trauma and fear that's been brought on by wildfire in recent years. We have a lot of people who come out, just after they lost their home in a fire, and they say, I want to learn about fire. I can't stop it from being here, so I want to learn how to use it. And those are really powerful moments. So as we at Point Blue have recognized this growing community need for more prescribed fire, we created this brand new fire stewardship ecologist position to support the use and research of prescribed fire. I was fortunate enough to step into this position in January of this year. Prior to that, I was a partner biologist with Point Blue and a federal agency called NRCS. But I now get to collaborate with regional partners like the Good Fire Alliance to help landowners plan and conduct burns. And I also work with Point Blue staff and other partners to establish monitoring and research projects that analyze the effects of this intentional burning on plant and soil communities. A great example of this is the monitoring that our partner biologist, Alicia Herrera, is doing at Shasta Land Trust Ross Ranch property, where they're looking at plant and bird responses to prescribed fire in grasslands and oak woodlands. We also have other Point Blue staff in the Sierra foothills and lower Cascades who are working to support prescribed burning, as well as working more with cultural fire practitioners in those areas to support the continuation and expansion of cultural burning practices. So I realize I've thrown a lot of information at you, but if there's one thing I want you to come away with, it's just remember that fire in California is incredibly nuanced, both socially and ecologically. And there are many ecosystems in our state that now experience a deficit of fire. And in these areas, prescribed fire is a valuable and scalable tool that we can utilize in reducing future wildfire severity, maintaining ecosystem health, and mitigating the long-term carbon emissions created by large wildfires. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much for all of your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
I just want to jump in here. Thank you so much, Taj. That was so good. There was so much there, and I loved how there was so much technical information nested within the larger context, historically, culturally, and mentioning trauma. And that's something that so many of us in California are so familiar with. So thank you so much for that. Open up to questions. I know we have about 9 minutes left. So the rest of this time is dedicated to any questions that anyone has. You're welcome to put them in the chat or unmute and ask them directly. And we'll hang out for a little bit in case anything pops up for anyone. I am kind of curious. In the option to do it yourself as a landowner, so you mentioned the templates through Cal PBA, was it? Mm-hmm. Is that kind of, because it seems like a huge undertaking. I mean, you went through all the steps of like all your planning that you do, and for a landowner to kind of like initiate this on their own, what would that look like? Would it be kind of going off a template, and like who could they consult?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say, so I guess I should have prefaced by saying we in the North Bay, we always have a burn plan for our units. We stick to those burn plans, and I mentioned there's some. If you have any sort of issues with your burn, there's a real value in having that burn plan written in a legal context. And given that we are in an area where there's a fair amount of houses and potential risk, we really cross all of our T's and dot all of our I's with those types of practices and, preparing a burn plan and all of that. I would say that that's not necessarily the case everywhere. A lot of people, you don't have to develop a burn plan, but it's encouraged. I know a lot of people will just start burning on their property. A lot of folks, especially a lot of families who have been in an area for a long time, whether it be ranching or managing forest land, they have been burning for generations, and they have a memory of how to do this, and they know what works. They know what kind of weather they need. So they don't necessarily go that like intensive planning route. But for those who do want to go that route, I would, it really depends on what region you're in. So I think that's actually where the prescribed burn associations become really valuable, is even if they're not utilizing people to run their burn the day of, there's a lot of people involved in prescribed burn associations who come from the Forest Service, who come from local fire departments, who come from CAL FIRE, people who are really knowledgeable about how to manage fire and are able to and willing to provide that sort of experience and expertise to help people plan. So I would say reaching out to your local prescribed burn association is super valuable. Beyond that, there are some people in key regions that are huge assets, like Lania up on the North Coast, and there's some people around here, and also in the Sierra foothills, but it, that gets a little more local. So
no, thank you so much. Yeah, that helps. Just, I imagine it's pretty intimidating if there's someone who's interested and wants to do it, but doesn't have, the the money to drop on a burn boss or
yeah.
yeah. So that helps a lot.
Yeah, I will also say that that kind of expertise has become somewhat of a limiting factor for us in the North Bay. We have, like I said, 350 people that are all, trained and certified and excited to come work on a burn, but we don't have a lot of people with the experience in planning burns and leading burns to lead those people. So it's really become this bottleneck where a ton of people want to burn their land, a ton of people want to come out and help on a burn, but not many people have the ability to do that planning and organizing and leading. And I've been fortunate in the last year or so to be part of a fellowship with that program called Fire Forward, where they have provided us a lot of courses and training to develop this kind of knowledge and how to plan and lead burns. And really, they did that to address this bottleneck. And so there's 10 of us that have gone through this fellowship now. They're going to do it. They're going to run it on an annual basis. And it also helps us build that kind of capacity within other organizations in a region. So the burden of planning and leading these burns doesn't fall on one individual or one organization, but is really decentralized so we can get more work done at a faster pace and scale.
Right. And is that fellowship, who is that available to? Is it only open to people with backgrounds in fire, or is it kind of just general interest?
Yeah, it's open to anyone. I will say it's local to the North Bay.
Okay.
So they're trying to build capacity in the North Bay area.
Yeah.
But yeah, they actually just put out their announcement for next year's fellowship, and they encourage people to have some fire experience already. It's nice to know that people already have interest and some buy-in into this, but you aren't required to be a certified firefighter going into that. So it's open to anyone and everyone.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, it's been so great to hear your experience, and I can tell through just how you speak about what you do that you are really dedicated to it. So thank you for sharing that with all of us. And yeah, anyone else that missed this, the recording will be up on our website very shortly. So you'll be able to rewatch it there or watch it for the first time. And with that, yeah, we will hopefully rejoin, all come back together for the next lunch series. So thank you so much. Thank you, Taj, again, 100 times over. I really appreciate this.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. All right. Bye, everyone.
Take care.